Hi, I'm Kent Greenfield. I'm a professor of law at Boston College Law School, and I've been teaching at Boston College for about 16 years now. I do constitutional law and corporate law. Yeah, so one of the things I've been fascinated about in my work on this book is how obedient humans tend to be to people in authority, right? And of course, obedience is important. Right? As a parent, I want my kids to be obedient, and sometimes parents or police officers do know better, and we ought to obey. The problematic thing is sometimes we obey without thinking, and we don't actually assume uh, that we have a choice to dissent when we should. Two examples. Now, the most famous experiment about this is Stanley Milgram's experiments in Yale back in the 60s. These experiments that couldn't really be done the same way anymore, but what he brought people into his lab, two supposed volunteers, one of whom was cast as the learner and one was cast as the teacher. The learner was put into a private room where electrodes were strapped to his wrist, and the teacher was put in a different room. And the experiment was supposedly about the effect of punishment on learning. So the so-called teacher, volunteer would read words, and it was basically a memory game. And the learner in the next room, every time he got a word wrong, the teacher would shock him with an electric shock. And the teacher sat in front of an electronic console, and the shocks were to start with very minimal, a 15-volt shock, and worked up in increments all the way up to 450 volts, which is lethal. In fact, they were labeled such, mild, somewhat mild, severe intensity, intense, and the last three the slots on the board were just labeled XXX. And as it turns out, Milgram was brilliant in his experimental design because the so-called learner was in on the game. And he was not actually being shocked, and he followed a certain script. After 270 volts or so, he would start screaming, "I refuse to go on. Let me out of here." And he would bang on the door. And after a while, he would start screaming, "I have a heart condition. Please let me out." And then eventually would fall silent. And the question was, how far would the teachers go? And there was a man in a lab coat, and every time someone hesitated, the man in the lab coat would say to the teacher, "You must go on. You have no choice." And of course, they weren't being coerced. They could get up and leave any time. It was a test of how they responded to authority, the authoritarian scientist in the obligatory lab coat. So Milgram asked about a bunch of psychologists ahead of time how many people they believed would go all the way to the end of the board, and the answer was fewer than 1 in 1,000 would go all the way up, who would shock people to the lethal point. As it turns out, 60% of the so-called teachers went all the way to the top. 80% went beyond the point when the learner was refusing. So we learned in that experiment in the early 60s that people are really attuned to the orders of authority. And what's interesting, going back and reading and watching, there's actually a film about it, watching the film, is how constrained people thought they were. Look, I had no choice. The scientist kept telling me that I had to go on, so I had no choice but to shock this individual. So, and also Milgram figured out that he could manipulate the numbers if he had other people in the room with the teacher who went along. He could get the obedience rate over 90%. If he had people in the room that refused to go along, who dissented, he would decrease the obedience rate to 20 or 30%. So the thing that he learned was that we're really susceptible to influence, especially of authority figures. So one might think, okay, this is the 60s. It's a famous experiment. It's famous in part because it seemed so outrageous to people. Maybe one could say so shocking to people. But it could never really be replicated now. But as it turns out, that it has been replicated in more modern experiments using more modern ethical guidelines. In fact, it was just done in France last year. There was a documentary that set up a make-believe game show. They had a person in a soundproof booth who was answering questions, and every question he got wrong, somebody from the audience would shock him. And over 80% of the contestants shocked the person past the point they thought they were killing him. So even today, when we think we're more questioning of authorities, people follow authority, especially in settings where they're encouraged by groups. The other example I talk about in the book is the example of the self-help guru in Arizona, the sweat lodge guru, so-called. And this is an example of where we follow authority. We want the approval of authorities, even to our own detriment. So what happened in Arizona a couple of years ago was that people went to this self-help camp. They paid about $10,000 apiece to be trained to take control of their lives. And over a course of 5 or 6 days, they went through all these different routines and different tests and to try to figure out how to take control of their lives. But it ended up with 36 hours in the desert with no food and water to come, I guess, be one with yourself. And then he brought them back and put them in a sweat lodge for 2 hours, heated with hot coals, hot rocks. And the James Arthur Ray, the guru, sat at the tent flap and essentially belittled anyone who would leave. So even here, people were, and as it turned out, people were in grave danger because they were dehydrated, they were hot, and as it turns out, many people started to collapse, many people started getting sick, but people stayed. He wasn't forcing them to stay, but people stayed because they feared walking past him through the tent flap. 3 people died. As it turns out, James Arthur Ray was arrested and he recently convicted for negligent homicide because the jury understood what I'm talking about, which is that his authority sort of overbore their free will in an important way. So I think one of the things that I say in the book, and that I want people to what I learned in the book, is that we're much more obedient to authority figures without even knowing it, and that it's one of the areas where we have less choice than we actually think. Okay, so markets are a source of choice for many of us, right? We walk into Target or Costco or Safeway, and it's overwhelming choice. The typical grocery store has about 45,000 different items. The marketplace provides us not only a way to sell our labor and to buy things we need, but also things like kids' treadmills with nose hair clippers, therapeutic beds for a dog. So there are a lot of things out there that's available to us in the marketplace. The problem with the so-called free market is that it's only free if you're able to buy. Right? The so-called free market provides resources to people who can pay for them. And if you don't have resources, markets are not a source of choice, but a source of choicelessness. So if you allocate things according to willingness and ability to pay, if you don't have something to pay with, then they're not a source of choice. So that's in some ways is an obvious example, but often it's denied in the rhetoric about markets. I talk in the book about this man named Henry Lamson, who was the source of a case here in Massachusetts about 100 years ago. He was an axe handle painter. And so he would stand there all day painting axe handles, and he would stand under a shelf where the axe heads were stored. And he warned his boss at one point, look, I think this shelf is about to fall. Why don't you fix it? And the boss said, look, you can choose to work here or not. I'm not going to fix the shelf, but it's your choice, stay or leave. And he stayed. And the shelf fell. he was injured by a falling axe, and he sued. And in fact, he lost in Massachusetts courts in an opinion written by Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. before he went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And Holmes said, look, he made his choice. And my point is that he made his choice in a market in which he was really constrained. He didn't really have a choice to not go to work because he needed to provide for himself and his family. And that's true about a lot of people around the world. I talk about my grandfather, who was a coal miner in Kentucky, who would pay with his groceries with scrip, which was a form of money that he was paid with, that coal companies used to pay their workers with, and they could only redeem that cash, that form of payment, in company stores. Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me because I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store. That line was the number one song in America back in I think 1956 maybe. I have to check that date. But it's because it was true that people were constrained by the marketplace, even though we think about the market being free. Now, the other point about the market is that it doesn't allow us to choose to be insulated from the market. The one thing that's true about market is, again, like water, right? It seeps into every corner of our lives, whether we like it to or not. It commodifies things that we don't want commodified, even if we choose not to commodify them. The obvious examples of this are body parts and sex. Body parts, there's actually a thriving market, black market throughout the world in body parts. The going rate for a kidney in India is about, you can sell one of your kidneys in India for about $1,600. But the going rate to buy one in the developed world is about $150,000. So there's a big, because of that discrepancy, there's a big market for organ brokers. And there are such things as organ tourists who will fly from the United States to India for a kidney. And people sell their kidneys because they have no other choice to raise funds for their family. I quote one individual, one man in India who sold his kidney because his other option was to sell his daughter to provide for his family. And that certainly doesn't, even though that's the way the free market would work if it were left unregulated, it certainly is not free in any robust meaning of that word. Sex, just to mention, sex trafficking is a real problem in the world. About 1 million children are trafficked for sex every year, about half of whom are under the age of 16. So it's the market, left to its own devices, will commodify everything, whether we choose to commodify those things or not. Thank you. Enjoyed it.